So yeah, hello. I'm Andrew Harmel-Law. I am a tech principal at ThoughtWorks. And interesting fact about me, so I was born 7 miles away from the other Banff, so not this Banff, but the other Banff, which is almost entirely unlike this Banff in every way possible. So, but it's kind of cool to come here and see what this Banff looks like. And then we've got a Banff Springs as well, which is again nothing like the Banff Springs that you guys have here. But other qualifications for talking: I lived in Vancouver for 6 months, so I know how awesome Canada is, and I know Todd. So I just want to say, like, a super thank you for Todd for inviting me, putting all this on. I know how much work it is, and to see the quality of the speakers and the number of people who've come out and stuff, and here he is, Todd himself, is really awesome. So yeah, so what I want to talk about is organizational refactoring and culture hacking. So, which might sound like a terrible attempt to get you to listen to kind of people-oriented stuff, but hopefully it's not just that. It's more, and it actually goes. It kind of plays into some of the stuff that Mike mentioned earlier on, and definitely goes into some of the stuff we just heard in the previous session. So, I think it's super useful. I think it's super exciting, and hopefully I can convince some or all of you that it's something, maybe a new topic that we'll hear more of in tech conferences. So as is traditional, I'm going to start with a quote. This quote is from me on Facebook sometime in 2014, and I kind of posted it, so it was private, because I don't obviously let everyone see my Facebook post, because that's ludicrous. But it got quite a few likes, and a few people shared it, and a bunch of people commented on it. And it was basically, I posted it because I had just been involved in a bunch of stuff which was not to do with writing code, and instead was very people-centric. And for me, as someone who was a developer, this was surprising. And what was most surprising was that I was enjoying this, which I did not think would happen. So that was something I posted in 2014. Not breaking the rules, this is a quote from someone who's famous, unlike me. So this is a quote from Eli Goldratt. I'm not sure how many people here have heard of Eli Goldratt. DevOps folks have heard of him a lot because he wrote the book The Goal and a bunch of other books. If you haven't read The Goal, I will recommend you read it later on. But it's fantastic. What you probably have heard of, if you haven't heard of The Goal, is you will have heard of the Phoenix Project. If you've read the Phoenix Project, and then you read The Goal, you'll be like, these guys totally ripped off The Goal, because they did. So the Phoenix Project is still good, but definitely read The Goal, because we're clever enough to realize that just something doesn't have to have a software delivery project in it to make it relevant to what we do. And so Eli Goldratt wrote this quote from him. So features have no value until they're in the hands of a user and being used for productive effort. So immediately kind of seeing this and reading The Goal and other things, you realize that potentially lots of the things that we do, lots of things that I've done in the past, could be deemed to have had zero value whatsoever. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on, any activity not spent getting to the next valuable feature, that's any activity, and the next most valuable feature, not the one after that, but the next most valuable feature, into the hands of users is waste. So again, as looking back over my career, that's a pretty damning indictment of lots of things. We've done things and delivered value. I've been a consultant for 14 years. We've done what people have asked us to do. And sometimes we've done what people haven't asked us to do, but which has been the right thing anyway. But even against those criteria, that's pretty harsh stuff to take on board. And so somebody needs to be to blame, right? Because it's easy, it's never my fault. It's always someone else's fault. So what we could do is we could find someone who's to blame for this. So typically in software development, we're very good at finding other people to blame. So the QA gets to blame quite a lot. Apologies to anyone who is a QA in the room. Or the project manager, an awesome source of blame. Project managers are typically, great sources of the reasons things go wrong. Or alternatively, another team, typically the team who's building something that you're relying upon, so maybe the core services team, or maybe the DevOps team, because they're frequently always to blame. Or just another team that's building another microservice which you're depending directly upon, right? So it's their fault. So you could deploy and you could deliver value, but you can't because that stuff's there. Or middle management. So I don't know what the culture's like in Canada. In the UK, we're fantastic at having too much middle management. So much so that we've got, like there's TV shows like The Office, which has made it over to North America. It's become like this cultural phenomenon that's to blame. Or alternatively, we could blame the people, the executives, the people who are running the show, right? Because it's their fault. They're telling us to do this when we should do that. There's plenty of people to blame. Unfortunately, if we're kind of step back and be slightly more rational, blaming an individual for something which might not necessarily be ultimately their fault, typically ends badly, right? Maybe with a mob and pitchforks, but it's probably, it makes you feel better to wave like a rake at people, but that might not solve the problem, right? And that's potentially why these things keep happening over and over again. So I kind of got frustrated with thinking that, it being someone else's fault. So I thought I'll look around at stuff, and I'll see what else I can learn to see if there's another way of looking at this. So this is a quote from another book that I read, which is called The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. And so he says, placed in the same system, people, however different, tend to produce similar results. So now he's introduced this thing called the system, right? We can blame the system, which we're also quite good at blaming. But he's saying something more interesting than that. He's not just saying it's the system which is kind of the result of lots of people working together to produce something. The system is something that has its own life, because if I'm, occupying role A in the system, be it a QA or a manager or some other team, if we replace me with someone else or replace team A with team B, we haven't changed the system, you'll get the same results. So I was like, oh, this is a big deal. So I started thinking about stuff like this. So if we accept that because that feels like something we could relate to, and Senge came to this this conclusion after doing lots of investigation, lots of research. Lots of people have kind of looked at things. Since I've read this, have been watching what I've seen in projects, and you can see that it seems to make sense. So therefore, I started trying to do my own experiments, and that's some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about and relay some of the experience. So if we accept that this might be a valid hypothesis for making things better, the way to deliver more value and get rid of waste, how do we fix it? So it turns out that developers are not the only people who are good at moaning about stuff because we think it's broken. It turns out that management also think things are broken, right? Because management gets shouted at a lot when Team X hasn't delivered something. So they'll come and vent to us and say, you haven't delivered something, it's all your fault. But they'll still be the people who are bearing responsibility. So management, especially executive, kind of senior management, do what we will have all experienced, and I'm terming traditional reorgs and transformations. So they will go, right, it's definitely, it might be the people, but it might also be the way we're structured. So what we're going to do is we're going to restructure or reorg our organization. And where I've worked in places where every 2 years they do a reorg just because it felt like the right thing to do. Or an agile transformation. I'm a consultant. I've been paid to do agile transformation, so I've been potentially part of the problem, maybe in a past life. And we've come in to change your mindset and all this kind of stuff because someone's read a book. And so I'm not saying they don't succeed. I have watched ones which do succeed, but they don't always succeed. And I'm going to talk about other ways that we can maybe achieve the same goals, but also I want to kind of pull out some things which I think define this kind of tablets of stone, this is what you shall do type thing. So typically, traditional reorgs and transformations, which I'm going to contrast in a minute, are top-down, they're imposed via the hierarchy. Because they're top-down, and this is why we love to moan, they have less context. So we'll have an experience of how things work and how we deliver the value to our customers. The view from higher up the hierarchy will be different. It might be a broader view, but it might not have the detail and the nuance and the context of what's happening. Because they're higher up the hierarchy, they've got more power, more access to budget, so there'll be big bang, they'll have brought in consultants to do it, and they'll probably stop the world. So they'll be like, right, everybody stop. This is the old way of working. We're not going to do the old way of working. We're now going to do a new way of working, and this is how it's going to be. And because of that, they're slow, because you can't change people's mindsets overnight, so therefore there's the implementation phase, and then there's the rollout phase, and all of these different phases. And because of lots of these reasons, lots of times these things fail. So I'm going to argue, in a minute, that we can do, as software engineers, we can do a better job. And so why can we do a better job? If you think about it, in our jobs as software engineers, we are very used to dealing with complicated systems. These days with microservices and Lambdas and even worse, we're very used to dealing with complex distributed systems that are built by lots of different people in lots of different places. We deal with unpredictability. We deal with the fact that things can fail. We deal with the fact that our code bases change all the time, requirements change all the time. We're used to having to cope with the fact that what we think at the start is the goal rapidly stops being the goal after 6 months. And we're also very used to collaborating really closely and designing and building these things with other people, because we very infrequently do things on our own. We do this with a group of other people. So I think the skills that we have as software developers help us to do this. So I've summarized this in three slides. So number one, an organization's structure is best served by being in a constant state of change. So, going even further than doing a reorg once every year when things look like they're, everything's on fire and you're failing to deliver. Potentially, if the market is changing all the time and our customers are changing all the time and competitors are changing all the time and the tech landscape is changing all the time, why wait for a one-year cadence to do it? Why don't we just continually, like with code, change things all the time? Number two, I believe that the best people to drive these changes frequently are those closest to the action, and that's us. That's the people building the things, the people living the organization and culture that the organization has. And what I'm going to argue most strongly is that it's our skills, the skills I just pointed out, the things about designing distributed systems, thinking of how we build these systems and how we collaborate to do it. Those skills are the exact same skills which we can use to design these things. So without further ado, I'm now going to talk about, there's 5 kind of patterns. There's loads more. So, and I get quite carried away about how exciting I personally think this is. There is loads more I could talk about. So I'm going to try, if I can, to leave time at the end for questions. But also, if anybody, I'm going to be here for the rest of today and tomorrow and a bit of Sunday. If people want to ask me questions about this stuff, please come and talk to me. So what I've tried to do is kind of give you enough in these 5 topics I'm going to talk about, enough of something to kind of get to grips with so you can understand hopefully why I'm arguing, that it might be a useful thing to do, and also enough to kind of maybe start asking questions going, well, that might work for me, but that might not because of this. And then you'll kind of start engaging with it. The other thing is I've tried to explain each one based on a story so we can relate to it. But because typically at tech conferences, the stories you hear are our dev team did this thing, and this is this technology that we adopted. You put yourself in the mindset of someone who's doing the doing, who's using the thing that you're talking about. And what I want to do is tell stories which help you think about things from the perspective of the customer, right? So, if we're talking about value and reducing waste, what I want to do is tell a story where you would be the person who gets the value, not the person who reduces the waste. So hopefully that makes sense. So we'll see. I've also tried to come up with cool names for things in the vain attempt to make people remember these things that I'm talking about. None of these ideas are mine, but the stories are kind of, and the implementation things are my experiences. So we're going to talk about mapping the human architecture, reading the dynamic system, making the right change, killing consensus. We should definitely kill it, not just like pacify it. And then moving beyond delegation. So I'll just, there we go. So number 1, map the human architecture. So, before I go on. Mapping the human architecture. I know that as a consultant, lots of the time, once every 2 or 3 years, I'll go into a new customer, so I'll have to kind of get to grips with a new code base, typically which will be, worryingly these days, sometimes some of the people in the teams are younger than, I'm 42. I'll be working and pairing with people who are younger than some of the code that we're checking out, which is kind of exciting. But there's, everyone has this kind of code base. So whenever you go to a new company or you start a new project or you move to a new team, we have this task of understanding what this thing is. And they never, ever, ever have complete and up-to-date documentation. They don't. But there is typically there's people who understand things. And there's techniques and tricks that you can use which don't involve going to the first, the most alphabetical, start of the alphabet package and then the class with the which has the name closest to the start of the alphabet, and then start at the top of the class and read the package declaration, and then read the imports, and then read the methods. That's not how you do it. There's other techniques. So are these some kind of ways that we can use to apply to do things? So this first story. So it begins when I was at my previous company, still a consultancy, and I'd got kids, so I thought getting promoted was a good idea because then I could get a pay rise and I could earn more money, and we could afford to get the kids thousands of lessons in I don't know, loads of different stuff. So they could fill all of their waking moments with activities. So I applied for a promotion, got a promotion. Never for a second did I think that I'd given additional responsibility with this promotion. So it was a great surprise to me to discover that I now not only had a pay rise, but I had to look after a team of 36 developers who were my peers, and I still had to do my day job. So I still had to be a consultant and go and deliver stuff for clients, but I had to look after 36 engineers. So, and then my boss left to go to ThoughtWorks, where I now am. So you can read things into this if you will. But luckily for me, before he left, he did a 3-hour handover. Not that I'm bitter about this at all. A 3-hour handover which explained everything that he did in this job to cope with looking after me and my 35 other colleagues. So he produced this beautiful mind map, which was very clearly structured, which would explain all of the additional responsibilities I now had, how the team worked, what responsibilities we had to the other parts of the organization, et cetera, et cetera. He then talked for 3 hours, and I wrote this. So this is genuinely, I should have checked a bit more carefully. I don't think there's no ad hominem attacks or anything, but there were exclamation marks all over the place because it looked like it was terrifying. So at the end of it, I knew everything I needed to do, but I had no mental model of how. I thought I knew how the team worked. It turns out I had no idea how the team worked. I just knew how my bit worked and how to request training courses, and everything else was an utter mystery. And so this kind of exemplifies my panic. And so I had no idea. So what I needed to do was figure out how to make a new mental model of this kind of thing. So because I went home, panicked, my wife said, "You're used to dealing with complicated stuff all the time. Surely you can draw yourself a picture," because that's what you tell me you do half the time, draw pictures of boxes and lines, and restructured this in. And she pointed out, my old boss, who I was now taking over a part of his job, he didn't, he survived. So there must be something inside this big mess of information, a structure of things and how they work. So I thought like a developer. So you'll see the thinking like a developer emoji coming back. The problem is, the typical way that I would have kind of represented an organization, or even this little chunk of the organization, was an org chart. Org charts are horrific, and they tell you no information. In fact, they lie to you about a million different things. So luckily I'd read another book, which again you'll get reading lists at the end of this, which had a new way of representing things. So it's a thing from Holacracy, but I believe it originally comes from Sociocracy, which I haven't read. And it says you can represent the work to be done, or the responsibilities that are undertaken in a group of people, completely separate from the people themselves and the job titles, and then represent that in a way which is known as circles and roles. So the key things is roles. So a person can have multiple roles, and then a role typically has 3 things. So a role has a purpose, a role has one or more accountabilities, and a role may have 0 or more domains. So that's abstract. So if you're a developer role, and you might also have Spinnaker Guild member role as well. If you're, developer might not describe everything you do, but the bit of your job, which is coding, could be a developer role. The accountability for that might be, or the purpose for that, might be deliver valuable features to production, which are tested. The accountabilities for that might be things like keep the build green, do enough documentation that everyone else knows what you're doing, so that when you go on holiday, people can maintain your code, write clean code. That could be another accountability. And a domain might be like a physical thing like the code base, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe if you're doing you build it, you run it, then it's the running service. So those are the things. That's the definition of a developer role, but you might play other roles. A circle is just something which, when a role looks like it's getting too big, you split the role into multiple roles and you group them together in a circle. So a circle still has a purpose, and it still has accountabilities, and it might have domains. And you'll see an example in a minute. But it just contains roles, and then just like kind of cells creating organs, creating an organism, you can nest circles within circles. So this seemed like a pretty cool thing, especially as I originally wanted to do biology at university. So I thought, I'll use this to map this mess, which I initially dumped into a gigantic circle called the stuff I have to cope with. And I thought, right, I'm not going to refactor anything. I'm just going to put things, group things, potentially taking clues from this mind map, but not necessarily, to figure out where things live. So I'm not changing the names or anything. I'm just grouping things together. And I ended up with this. So you can see the big role is the Java team. So I'd realized that it was more than just me. Java team, and then within that there were other roles, other circles. I haven't shown the roles, but I can talk about them a little bit. Training we'll come back to. So there was a marketing role. So things I hadn't really thought about when I was a member of the team. We did marketing, right? We'd have to hire people. So we had, when I asked to speak at a conference, that was a marketing effort, right? Because it was getting our brand out there. We were sharing information, but also doing things. So we had a conferences circle within the marketing thing, because within conferences, there might be a role like approve Andrew going to a conference because there's a cost, and check that he's not going to talk about stuff that we shouldn't talk about. Those were the roles, but within the marketing role, within the conferences role. And all the other ones, gig management was like putting people onto projects. The bench is what we call, at ThoughtWorks we call the beach because it sounds nicer than the bench. Very similar. The bench is where people are when they're not on a project. Individual projects had things as well. We did loads of pre-sale support, which again I was completely unaware of, but turns out actually happened. Loads of stuff. So we mapped this out, and so suddenly I could get this really nice view of what was going on. So that's what we got. So, some tips, many of which I've hopefully just mentioned. So number one, this is really useful because, as I just said, you think you understand how things work, even in the team that you work in, you quite possibly don't. So, I overestimated what I knew, then it turns out there was a load of stuff that I didn't know. So if you are in a team, don't ever assume that other people know the other things that you do. There's a lot to find out. Rather than an org chart being a map of power and influence, this is a real map of power and influence, because you can see which kind of roles, many of which might be held by the same person, but you can see who gets responsibility to sign things off, who has budget. So marketing had budget, I discovered, so I could get t-shirts made, like this t-shirt. So you can see you can see where the levers are. By creating this thing, I didn't just create it to keep myself sane. My wife pointed out, and it was very true, you could just show this to the rest of your team. So that was a screenshot from the much maligned Confluence. We put the picture on the wiki so that people could see when they joined the team, this is how it works. And the other thing is you don't need to be in charge. I was in charge because I was worried that I wouldn't meet all the requirements that I needed to meet. But you don't need to be in charge to do this. And building it, by doing this, you learn loads. So just like kind of getting your head around, drawing out the diagram of the main moving parts of a software system, you get a good idea of where the key parts of the software system are. And, we'll get onto this later, what you can see, you can change. So this is just right here, right now. It's not future stuff. It's right here and now. And it's literally, if it sounds simple, it is as simple as boxes and lines. It's roles and circles, and that's it. So that's the first one. If you want to read more, you can read this book, Hierarchy. The subtitle is misleading because it doesn't abolish hierarchy. It lets hierarchy emerge if you do the full thing. Because you still need people who are kind of directing and taking responsibility for things when not everyone might want to take responsibility. But you don't have this ossified hierarchy, which is just there because that's what the hierarchy is. So I definitely recommend reading that. So the next one is read the dynamic system. So if we're trying to think like software engineers, everybody knows that if you drew a big class diagram or a bunch of component diagrams to represent your microservices, typically like you see from Netflix, that only gives you one view, but as we just heard in the previous talk, there are services which are on the critical play path or something. I can't remember what it's called. But the things that if they break, my play button stops working. So that's the dynamic view. You could color them in different colors, like red, in a static view of a system. But what you really want to see is how does the execution flow? How does events flow through a system? How do the moving parts of the system combine to deliver the value or get stuff going? So that's what we're going to talk about now. So I said before we were going to talk about training. When I got my 3-hour meeting, I was told that I had to approve training requests, full stop. Approve training requests. We're now going to find out how complicated approving training requests is if you have a day job. And like I say, to begin with, there were 35 colleagues. Then we got asked to hire 50 people. So when I left, there were 98. So it was me and 98 people. There's another talk I gave about that. So this is in my head. This is what happened. I'm the cop. And you can, turns out emoji are amazing for drawing diagrams. An email request would come in. I would say yes or no, and it would go next to the next person down the pipe. Fantastic. So I could totally do that. That's really simple. Even with 35 people, right, there's a limit to how much training they can request. It turns out that it was a bit more complicated. So, number one, they didn't always email me. Sometimes people would, like, if they were on my project, where I was, because we were working spread across the UK, they might just chat to me and ask if they could go on a thing. And I'd sometimes forget, say, can you send me an email? Or they would IM me. So things you realize you become promoted to become a leader when you've got 17, or behind IntelliJ IDEA, you've got 17 chat windows open and they're all flashing on the bar at the bottom. Other times, someone in management had been approached by someone, I don't know, at Pivotal, who'd be like, we're going to give away really cheap spring training. Would you guys like to go on the spring training? Awesome. So I'd have to ask everyone if they'd like to go on spring training. So that was it. There was lots of things. Also, lots of emails would come in, some of which would say, can I go on spring training, full stop, send. Other ones would be, I would really love to go on this blockchain conference on a cruise ship. It would be amazing, and it would be very useful. And then a massive business case, pages and pages, like tons of effort, because this person knew that a blockchain conference on a cruise ship would not go down well, so they had to justify it. That and everything in between. The other thing that I quickly realized was, so there was a lot of variation. Also, things happen at certain dates. So if someone requests a training course, if you don't get round to reading their training request, by the time the training course happens, they can't go on the training course, even if you say yes, because they can't go back in time. So they're all time sensitive. But despite this, I was batching them up. So this is kind of like me, a panic-stricken emoji cop guy. All of this stuff's coming at me, and it all looks different. It's all for different things. It's really, really complicated. So I thought like an engineer. So I thought, if this was a system, what would I do? Well, so the system is like a horrifically designed system. So I'm having to do tons of validation at the start, and not only that, I'm having to kind of send things back if something's not clear, like which spring course are you talking about? Email back to the caller, which spring course, and then the thing would come back in, and there'd be a long chain, and I hadn't even figured out how to do change responses in Outlook, because we had Outlook, so I'd just be tying things together. That was bad. The quality of this stuff coming in was bad. It would expire. Just loads and loads of stuff. It was really chatty. I was clearly a bottleneck, which if you're designing a system, this would be a bad idea. So I came up with an absolute genius idea, which was I will auto-approve all your training requests, no matter what they are. I'm not joking, I actually did this. Because I'd read all these books about trust-based organizations, right? So I blamed Todd and other people. Because this sounds amazing, right? So I was like, and also, I wasn't that naive. I did say, here are the criteria that I will apply to saying yes or no. Please apply them yourself. I trust you to apply these criteria. So I wasn't like a complete idiot. I thought it was a good idea, because I trust people, because these are my peers, they're my friends, right? So I know we're going to do a good job. So, and it totally worked. Unfortunately, it only worked for a small while, and we're going to talk about what happened next. So, I'd love to say I'm not like, this is a joke, and I'm just telling this story for the purposes of this presentation. I am as stupid as this, so I did actually tell people to do this. We'll now talk about what happens, because you can make changes all over the place, like in software, right? You can, if you look at a small piece of software and you see that this is a bottleneck, this is a problem, I can get rid of this bottleneck by just making it auto pass through. So if you think that's a bad idea, you're right. So we're now going to talk about the next thing, which is how to identify the right change to make the right improvement to your system. Because it turns out there was a bigger picture which I had completely failed to take advantage of, or take notice of. So on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, is the lovely person in finance who has even less context about the training requests than I do. So all of these things are now being auto-approved by me. They go straight through. Now, the person with far less context who doesn't know, like Spring, so a blockchain conference so we know enough. A blockchain conference on a cruise ship sounds like a hard sell. A Spring course, to us, is like, yeah, definitely, you should go on Spring, because everyone uses Spring. If you're in finance, you have no idea. They all sound insane. All of the names of every technology we use all sounds bonkers. So if you have no context, you have no idea whether these are spurious claims. Like knitting, they want to go to a knitting. Is knitting a I don't know. Or maybe they just like to knit. So now this person had the responsibility of saying yes or no to stuff, but they didn't know. So they were mailing me all the time to go, is Spring really a thing? And they did, to be fair to them, they learned a lot about what all of these bonkers technologies we use were. But yeah, so they were emailing me. So also, because there's now this bottleneck further down the pipe, I'm now getting loads of requests from all the people who requested the training going, where's my training request? I haven't had an approval yet. So as opposed to actually making my life easier, my life got worse. A lot worse. And so if you do read the goal, if anyone's read the goal, I was the robots. So when you get to the robots, I'd made myself the robot. Because I'd made completely the wrong change. So think like an engineer. What I should have done, with hindsight, and now what I would do, I should have looked at the nature of the requests that were coming in. I've already kind of talked about them. Some of them are really simple, bog standard. When you join, if you've never done Spring training, we will put you on a Spring training course as soon as possible, plus a few other ones just to get you up your Scrum training, just so you're vaguely conversant with the ways that we build, in most cases at my old company, software. Other times, you wanted to go to a blockchain conference on a cruise ship, what I genuinely believed was a good idea for this. This person knew a lot about blockchain. They could have got loads of information. But this should be a no-brainer. Yes, that should be, I need to help you write a business case, because there was a business case, as I mentioned, but it was written by a developer who doesn't know, like, A, how much spare time people who approve these things have, i.e. it was too long. They didn't know what people who approve it think is important and don't care about, like who the speakers are. If you don't know who the big people, in the world of blockchain are, then a list of very important people is going to be irrelevant. But the fact that, we think there's 3 of our clients might use it, or et cetera, is important. So we did this. So we split things out. And so this is the change that we then put in. We also said, based on the fact that we knew what the criteria were for these approvals, we created email templates, because we knew it would still be email-based, and we said, it's email-based, if you speak to me in the hall, then you need to then go and send an email in, because that's the way it goes through. We've created tags so people could create Outlook rules and all this kind of stuff. So all of this stuff is now coming in. We said, these are the criteria for it being a simple one. This is the list of courses. If it is, go straight through. Don't even email it to me. CC me if you like, but just go straight through. People in finance knew that this had the tag, that this was a simple thing. They saw that, they didn't care. They knew that I was engaging with people, so that it was fine. More complicated ones, there was probably a back and forth, right? Because we wanted, if someone wants to come and speak at Voxxed Days Banff, then we need to go. Is Voxxed Days Banff a big thing, or is it a small thing? Or is it, is it a known brand? Do we, and for Voxxed Days Banff, we say yes. Other stuff, we might not say yes. But it's a lot smaller. So I could stop batching things up. I could do things in real time. It was worth being interrupted from my day job to find stuff out. And then I would have put the work in. So then we'd forward it on to finance, who would have all the extra information and see all of my work on it in comments. And again, they would feel far more happier approving it. And so it was so successful that we almost maxed out our training budget, which was my personal target for the year. So there's some tips again. Number one, see the power of a small change. So typically, I said that you get these massive big refactorings and everything changes. Systems thinking, this is what this is based on, it's the small things. If you do a small thing, it can have a big impact. It can have a big bad impact, as I hope I've shown, but it can also have a very significant positive impact. But it needs to be the right change. And the other key thing is it needs to be given time to manifest. A system, things are not instantaneous. No matter, as software developers, and people say they want a real-time system, we know it's not real-time, we know it's just fast. But it's never real-time, right? The speed of light comes in to things. And this is a human-based system, so it's not even that fast. And that's why I thought I'd made my life easier, but it turned out, given 3 or 4 days, I'd made my life a lot worse. So again, from the goal, you'll see it in the goal, they think they've made things better, they've made it far worse. And again, with tuning systems, you can tune a bottleneck and flood something downstream, which just breaks and makes everything else worse. So what you need to do is observe the whole dynamic system. So the whole system in motion, not static. You need to observe the impact on the goal, which is why it's training, because hopefully everyone can relate to, someone not approving the training request. The goal is you getting an approval or a no, sorry, go and find another course. That's what you want, right? So my life being better so I can focus more on opening IntelliJ IDEA and writing Spring Boot code, that's not the goal. That's the goal of the project to deliver something to my client. The goal of keeping the team skilled up, that's just a local optima. Other things which are important, quality is really important. So if you delay, if you let quality slip in and don't discover it until 2 steps down the line, like if you're in finance and someone's requesting something spurious, the impact of trying to step back to where the context of where something should have been a high quality artifact takes a lot longer than if you fix it at source. And watch out for feedback, like I say. So like the finance people coming back to me to ask for information, and B, the people going, where's my training request? Those weren't like the initial kind of flow through of stuff. They were like the system breaking and making everything else worse. And if we think about this in software terms, we know this happens all the time. It's not unnatural to us, but we sit there and watch it happening in organizations all the time. So for this, I got a bit carried away. There's a lot of books you can read. But given my time again, I would start here. So Donella Meadows' book about thinking in systems, it will genuinely change the way you see the entire world. And when you get to the final chapters, she goes a bit like kind of messianic, and I completely agree with it. So it is an amazing book. The Goal is a novel, which you should all definitely read. There's a cartoon version of it, and I love graphic novels, but I would read the book, not the graphic novel. It's amazing. It was written in the 80s, as you can tell from the cover. But it's like this in real life, and you'll be like, this I can relate to this. Remember, I was the robots. Fifth Discipline is the longest book in the world. If you read the entire book, you get a secret membership of a secret society and a badge, which is buried underneath all my stickers. But it's genuinely got some amazing stuff in it. And the Toyota Way is like the classic lean kind of textbook Bible. But you can see all of this stuff in a real-world example. But what's really cool is they don't just cover the technical stuff. They don't just cover Kanban and Kaizen and all the buzzwords. The thing at the very start of it is like, these are the techniques, but the people are the core thing. So that's very important. So number 4, kill consensus. That's what I thought. So consensus is something which, as a consultant, we see a lot. And it's something whereby, we use consensus because of the way that organizations are structured, especially in the Western world. Consensus is used as a way of avoiding having to take responsibility for things, because if everyone else agreed, or we all agreed, then if something breaks, then it's not my fault. It's everybody's fault. So therefore, I feel safer about doing the potentially risky things because it was everybody's fault. The problem is, to get consensus, we typically have meetings. You don't have to have meetings, but meetings is how we mostly have it. And therefore, to get proper consensus for something big, we have to have a meeting with a lot of people. And so we've all probably sat in those meetings where someone with the calculator on their phone totals up the cost of the consultants in the room, which gets to like a spectacularly large amount of money for a 3-hour meeting, because we had to get everyone in the room to calculate, decide whether we were going to do this thing or not. And also, because you've got, this is a big decision, so you've had to go 3 months out to make sure everybody's not on holiday. So the meeting is also a long time away from when, right here, right now, we need a decision on this thing, so we should really just decide to do it. So consensus can make stuff slower, it can make stuff more expensive. It can just be like a real sticking point for loads of stuff. And so you can see meetings here, pre-meeting meetings. I've been to pre-meetings. This is not a joke. That's a joke. I've been to those meetings. They're not a joke. Everything. It's really bad. But if we thought of if we think like developers, consensus is like the worst. We architect, again, Netflix make a big, they talk about this publicly all the time. They architect stuff to reduce the blast radius of stuff, right? They architect stuff so that one thing breaking will have as small an impact as possible on everything else. So even just looking at this diagram, It looks deceptively simple, but this is where, in a Kafka cluster, which has got Zookeeper for added complexity, has attempt to sync data has failed. There is no longer a leader, right? So we're going to have a Kafka cluster leadership election, right? Because they need to have some agreement as to something that's going to happen on this cluster so that the entire thing doesn't go split brain and we overwrite everyone's records and we bill a lot of people for a lot of things that we shouldn't have billed them for. So this is terrifying. So as software engineers, I spend ages trying to architect things so that we have to have, sometimes consensus is needed. It's not never needed. But we spend ages architecting systems to avoid having to have consensus any more than we can possibly get away with. And yet, in the Western world at least, we love meetings because that's just the standard way of getting things done. So in this section, what I want to propose is something which is deceptively simple. It's really simple. It's going to fit on this slide. And what's amazing to me is it's people kind of sometimes hear about it and don't believe it can be true because meetings and getting consensus are the only ways that we, really as human beings, organizations of groups of human beings, is the only way we know how to get things done. But there's another way, and it's the exercise process. So number one, this is the rule. Anybody can make any decision. Anyone. Like at Netflix, right? So, if you want to push something to prod, then push something to prod. However, to avoid complete and utter carnage, what you should do is seek advice from everyone who will be meaningfully affected. So this is why it's the advice process, not complete and utter chaos. And those with expertise. So there is, the person therefore who's making the decision needs to figure out what the decision might be, look around and figure out what all of the pros and cons are, what all of the alternative options are. They need to do that by going and seeking advice, i.e. speaking to people about what they're going to propose and listening and hopefully writing down what those people say. So they need to properly take account of those things. People will be meaningfully affected. So again, people who might be within the blast radius or people upstream or downstream of you, but also those with expertise. But then even after all of that, you're still empowered to make the decision. So therefore, you short-circuit all of this stuff. But you also end up with someone, the decision is still owned by the person who makes the decision. And the person making the decision are the people with the context, the people who need the thing to be fixed or improved, right? So there's some tips. I have brought this to places I've worked, and I've used this in teams that I've worked with. But I understand, having been the person, kind of the manager, or the person who's kind of this feels like is going to impact spectacularly as the team goes off and does stuff, this can seem terrifying. So what you want to do is experiment with it and try it in a controlled fashion. So what we do more and more is we try it with architectural decision records. So you want architecture to not be like a governance process with a bunch of ivory tower architects who say no, and you have to document everything and then supply your architecture to them and they say yes or no. You want to, if your team wants to start using Kotlin as opposed to Java, and it's not going to affect anyone, you should look into it, write it up as an architectural decision record, and then you can tell the right people, but do it yourself. And ADRs are good because people can understand what the process is. It's a concept which is kind of quite big in the industry at the moment, so it's on the ThoughtWorks tech radar. So it's not just something that's come out of the blue after some lunatics read a book. So it's good. But you also, as a consequence of that, you'll get better decisions. So after people have seen this happening once or twice, they'll see, okay, that team changed into Kotlin from Java because they had people who'd already knew Kotlin and all of these other things. It turns out they're faster. So you can see when you've made these point decisions, people who've let these decisions be made, typically they would have made them now. You and the team are making them. You can see the benefits of doing these things. And as a consequence, you'll also see people not backing when things don't work. You won't see people backing away from things. You won't see people saying, oh, it wasn't my fault, it was someone else's fault. You'll see more ownership, speed, and transparency. Things will just happen. But just doing this, I've seen teams which were typically gummed up, teams staffed with awesome people who were hyper-motivated to build stuff, but were scared, are suddenly moving a lot more Netflix speed than typical some other speed. So you want to read about this. It's a tiny part of this book. So this book will also blow your mind. I'll come back to this book a little in a minute. But if you don't want to read the entire book, and the book, again, is quite thick, you can just Google advice process, and there's like a single wiki page on the wiki which goes with the book, and it says pretty much these are the 3 steps, plus here's some examples. So it tells you of companies that have used the advice process. Different companies use it in different ways, so it's nice to see the different ways of deploying it. And so now we move on to, hopefully we've still got lots of time. Yep, we're going to just move a little bit faster. Last one is beyond delegation. So it might come to your attention that I keep saying, these are refactorings, these are refactoring tips, but the talk was a talk about refactoring organizations and hacking culture, right? So where's the hacking, where's the culture gone? In beyond delegation, that's what I want to talk about. And what I want to do is revisit, if I want to try and introduce you to a concept around about thinking of a different way of doing things, not delegation, and then use that to re-look at the 4 topics we've just looked at and see if that throws them into a different light. And the core thing about this is we need to think about it from a cultural perspective. So finding a definition of culture is hard, it turns out. This is the best one I've found. So Edgar Schein, in the Toyota Way, says culture is the pattern of basic assumptions that a given group has invented, discovered, or developed to cope with its problems, i.e. it's how a group fills the gaps in between the structure and the hierarchy of how things are. And those problems might be external adaptation or internal integration. So it's kind of like, if we all know something's hard, and it makes us sad, so we make jokes about it. So, there'll be a culture of making fun of X, Y, Z, because if we actually owned up to the fact it was painful, we'd all get depressed. And so that brings us to the point that there's a correlate to the second thing that I proposed before. So the second postulate said, we, the makers, or people right at the sharp end, are the people who are in the best place to do this. What I didn't talk about was, I mentioned before, middle management and people higher up the hierarchy. Where does that leave them? And this is what's important. So to help us do this, there's something that we need to ask for from the people at the hierarchy, and that is to trust us to get on with improving things, and to trust us and provide us with things like opening up the information and making processes transparent. Because if you don't understand it and you don't have access to the information, then you can't fix it. And that's why it's important to point out, this is about power. So I mentioned the power a little bit when I talked about circles and roles. You map stuff out, and just by making it kind of visible, you can see where the power is. Again, if you look at the dynamic systems, you can see where power is. We talked with the decision process and consensus. Consensus has come about because it's a way of exercising power, but not necessarily always in a good way. And you'd be surprised. I discovered, having been promoted, very, very, very few people enjoy the power and responsibility that they have. In fact, it's typically, as I discovered, it's the thing that gets in the way of the day job. And most of the time, people will spend as much effort as they can trying to make the right decision, trying to get out of the way of other teams, trying to help them do stuff. And there's 2 ways to do it. One way is delegation, but there's another way. And the other way is devolution. So delegation is what, as soon as you get promoted and you realize you've got far too much work to do and you can't possibly do your day job and keep everything going and approve training requests and help the sales team sell new work and all this kind of stuff, what you will be told to do is you'll be told to delegate. And what that means is approving training is hard, so I should give training approval to Todd because Todd is awesome at approving training and can read email faster than me. And at the moment, he's on a project that's a bit quieter, so he's got a bit more spare time, even though I know it'll change in 3 months' time. So that's what we'll do. The problem is, I've given Todd a problem, right? I've already pre-framed it. I've given, all the criteria for success and everything is already predefined. So all Todd can do is just maybe create some Outlook rules to make life a bit easier and some auto replies and all this kind of stuff. But if he wants to implement a change like auto approving stuff, unless Todd is flying by the seat of his pants, he will probably come back to me and go, I'm about to do this, do you approve? And then it's come back to me, right? Which is bad. So I've given Todd a problem so I can cross something off my list. I haven't really made the problem go away for the organization. Devolution is different. Devolution is where you say, here is the context, here is the situation. You don't just have the task to do, the accountabilities, you have the power to make all the changes that are required because you're in the best place to do it. You're closer to it, so don't come to me. This is the way to do it. And that's the devolution way. So if we take that on and look back over all of the stuff that we previously looked at, it really changes and kind of puts rocket fuel underneath all of the things we previously looked at. So number one is advice process. So we already kind of talked about the fact the advice process unlocks letting people other than the person who's traditionally got the power responsibility to do things. But we need to we need to acknowledge that initially that will be held by the managers and people. And so what it will require is role models. So the way that it turned out that I learned initially to roll it out was when I had to make a decision, I would visibly and publicly go through the advice process. So it was still me making the decision, but I would make a big deal of going to speak to all the people who would be impacted, all the people who were experts, and then documenting what I was doing and sharing that as widely as possible, being open so people could see the steps that I was going through to make a decision. So A, they could see how I got to the decision, which is good. But B, I was modeling, especially if you're a parent, model good behavior, right? So it's also a safe way to transfer powers. If I get Todd to do approvals and Todd wants to change things, Todd can now say, I want to do this auto-approval thing, or I also want to, send out templates and have the 2 different templates for 2 different types of request. He can come to me and ask my advice, but Todd still makes the decision. I can't tell Todd not to do it. You decide, right? You have the power. It is your decision. You can do it. And it makes a massive difference. So people still feel like they're, sheltered and protected. They're not just being given, the fact that they're going to be shouted at. There's a mechanism for them making sure they're making a good decision, but they don't have to wait for everyone else to decide. So the next one is write changes in end-to-end dynamic systems. So, like I said, by doing this yourself, you will see the whole system. What you want to do is start making everyone aware of the whole system. So I didn't just make these changes in the training request system, and I did this in lots of different other ways too. I kind of drew pictures to show other people where the whole thing was. This is where you request something, then at the end you get the training approval back. So when it takes long, it has to go through these hops, and this is what this hop means. I also then started people who were kind of wanted to take on responsibility. For example, I hated working with the salespeople. That's not because I don't like salespeople, but it's just I was like, I'd rather just get on with delivery. I'd done sales in a previous job, or not. I'd supported salespeople. I wanted to do delivery. Other people were super keen to do this. So I helped them learn how to read these systems so they could look at them and go, right, this bit's broken and that bit's broken, but if we tweak this thing here, all of this stuff will be fixed. So encourage them to read the books, but also just kind of working through things with them to help them learn the process. And what we could then do is we could combine that with the advice process to move towards Kaizen, which everyone throws around all the time, but then you're doing continuous employment all the time, right? Improvement all the time. And the last one is circle and roles. So I've already alluded to it a little bit. It amazes me that my manager managed to stay sane doing all of these things because he kept the responsibility for lots of these things for himself just because he didn't want to impose on other people. But it was a big pressure on him. And so what amazed me was there were things like the engagement with sector, the salespeople. People they wanted better work, so they wanted to engage with salespeople. So I wasn't giving them what we'd call in the UK a hospital pass, which would mean, we've passed the football to you and you're probably going to get your leg broken when the defender tackles you. It was a good thing they wanted to own this responsibility because they wanted to fix stuff because they wanted better work. So it was a nice way of parceling up responsibility to give to them. What I did first for them was, because they were a bit trepidatious about taking this on, I would say, when I go on holiday, I won't say, this person is my holiday cover. I would say, these responsibilities or these circles, this person is covering. These circles, this person is covering. So my out-of-office message literally called the things out to say where you could go. After people got comfortable, then I could say, do you want the whole thing? I'm happy for it to be yours and it's your deal. All I'll ever do is kind of provide context down, again, like they do at Netflix, because you do have access to information across the company, so provide that context down, but you can do the decision making. And then just encourage people to fix stuff, right? If stuff's broken, we're engineers. We're really good at pointing out what's broken. We're also really good at designing stuff and encouraging them to use the skills they had to fix things. And then, like I say, back to the holacracy thing, you don't end up with no hierarchy. You'll end up with one person who's kind of the person who's typically responsible for approving new customers or technology stacks or something. It's not like a completely hierarchy-free organization because people emerge, but it lets them emerge based on the skills they have. And so I just wanted to kind of bring stuff back together. I don't know if those last things are refactorings or hacks. I think they are refactorings because they're concrete changes that you can make. But when you start to make them, you're not changing the culture. You will be uncovering the culture that's already there, but people are typically expressing outside of their day job because they have these desires to do things, but the structure and the distribution of power at the start of where you work at the moment won't be allowing them to bring those skills to bear. So as soon as you do give them power to bring those skills to bear, you will be, I guarantee, amazed at the things that they bring to bear. And so there's books about this. So this is a really cool book. The reason I did this talk is because there's lots of books about the end results. This is where, we all hear about how awesome Netflix is, but it's very, unless you speak to someone after a talk, how they got there, that's hard. Or, this is, you do Scrum and it's amazing, or do Lean and it's amazing. But there's very few things about like this, what it feels like to do it. This book is amazing. If anyone's skeptical about this anywhere, David Marquet doesn't do any of these ideas, but kind of goes in and transforms a nuclear submarine in the US Navy. So he doesn't transform all the US Navy, just the nuclear submarine. He completely transforms how those folks on that submarine run the submarine. And it's amazing. You'd be like, this is amazing. But also read that, because that's an awesome book. And that will tell you about all of this stuff and give you tons of case studies. There's a company, I think in France, that runs nuclear power companies like this, nuclear power stations. So if you can run a nuclear submarine and a nuclear power station using lots of these ideas, then we can definitely try it in software development, right? So, so what's next? Oh yeah, so I lied at the start. Well, I didn't lie. I gave you the false impression. I now think that this stuff is as much fun. So the feeling when you push to production? That feeling when not when you've made a change, but when you've kind of got out of the way if you're responsible, or if you're the person making the change, it is a very similar feeling to kind of getting out of the way. And that's an awesome thing. So if you can do that, then you can just see, and then suddenly everyone's trying to improve stuff. Everyone's looking for value. Everyone's looking for the value streams. It's absolutely amazing. And so, what questions has everybody got, if anyone's got questions? I've got 3 minutes left, so I've completely overrun. But I'll be around later on. Hello, yes.
Do you have any other kind of techniques or visualizations you like to use as you're trying to understand how the organization interacts and things flow through the value stream maps and circles and stuff?
So we do. So I'm also like a massive apologist for DDD. And so I didn't have the confidence to talk about all of these things because I didn't think people were interested enough until I went on Alberto Brandolini's event storming course. So event storming is like a new way of looking at DDD. And it's a way that you can represent, with technical people and business people in the room, you can draw effectively a value stream map of a full process. And so I've done it places where he famously needs a very large wall because these things are always more complicated. And that is the most powerful way I've ever seen, like some ThoughtWorks. So it's post-it note-tastic, so we love that. But because it gets the business, it's not technical. You can dive down into technical things. Nobody mentions aggregates. Nobody mentions bounded contexts. Nobody mentions any of that stuff. But you can see it emerge. Then there's I can't remember what it's called, but there's level 2, where you banish the business people, and then you go, right, you see that bit where the post-it notes change color? That's a bounded context. And then you can bring it down to tech. But you can see the handoffs. You can see the confusion. If you end up with like a big bulge in the middle, all of these things you can see, and you can map the systems as well. So there's a bit where I think you use a white post-it note to map systems, and then like people are systems as well. So you can say, at this point, it's carnage. So then a human being who's been here for 20 years goes in and edits stuff in the database because we can't build a system to automate this. So you can see all of these things, and it's ludicrously powerful. So I definitely recommend that. And in lots of these books, not all of them, but Alberto recommends, like other books by Eli Goldratt, I've read based on Alberto recommending them, and there's tons of stuff. So, and all the lean stuff. So again, the lean and DevOps people, it turns out, despite the fact that there are ops people who've seen the light, that's not very fair. But there's tons of stuff that they just take for granted and we don't. So this is why I want to talk about this stuff more, because I think we're really missing a trick, especially as we're really good at doing these things if we just give ourselves a chance. So. Other questions? Or stunned silence? I'll be around for the rest of today and tomorrow, and I'll be more relaxed because I've done my talk. So cool. Thanks very much.